May 10, 1940. Rotterdam, Netherlands. The Luftwaffe's bombers screamed overhead, their shadows racing across the Maas River like harbingers of death. A man stood on the eastern bank, watching German reconnaissance planes circle the steel bridge that connected the city to its industrial heart. His name was Johannes Klaassen. He had no military training, no intelligence background, no formal education beyond basic draftsmanship. Before the war, the Royal Dutch Architecture Board had rejected his bridge designs 3 times, calling his ideas impractical, fantastical, and the work of someone who doesn't understand structural reality. Now, as Nazi forces prepared to sweep across the Netherlands, a general would look at his sketches and call him something else entirely: insane. What Johannes built in the next 72 hours would become the most audacious deception in European military history. A trick so perfect that German intelligence would mark the wrong targets for bombing for nearly 4 years. A camouflage so brilliant that even Adolf Hitler's personal inspection teams would be fooled. This is the story they don't teach in history class. The story of how one rejected architect turned the Wehrmacht's own eyes against them. Stay until the end, because what happened next shocked everyone, including the man who made it possible. The problem began the moment the German invasion started. Not because the Dutch lacked soldiers, not because they lacked ammunition, but because they lacked time. The Wehrmacht's blitzkrieg doctrine relied on speed. Capture the bridges, control the rivers, paralyze the infrastructure. The Dutch had watched Poland fall in 28 days. They'd seen Denmark surrender in 6 hours. Military planners knew their flat, bridge-dependent country would be next. Rotterdam's bridges were the prize. 7 major crossings spanning the Maas River, each one a critical artery for commerce, military movement, and civilian evacuation. Destroy them, and you trap your own forces. Leave them standing, and you hand the Germans a highway into the heart of the Netherlands. The morning of May 10th brought clarity wrapped in terror. At 3:55 a.m., German paratroopers began dropping near Moerdijk Bridge, 20 miles south. By dawn, Fallschirmjäger held 3 key crossings. The pattern was obvious. The Wehrmacht needed Rotterdam's bridges intact to push their tanks and artillery north toward Amsterdam and The Hague. Dutch engineers received their orders at 6:17 a.m. Prepare the bridges for demolition, but don't blow them yet. Civilian refugees were still streaming across, thousands of them, old men pushing carts, mothers carrying children, the wounded from outlying villages. The bridges had to stay open. But keeping them open meant keeping them visible, and visible meant vulnerable. German reconnaissance flights began at first light. Dornier Doe 17s and Messerschmitt Bf 100s and 10s, flying in lazy circles at 8,000 feet, their cameras clicking away. The photographs would be developed at forward headquarters, analyzed by intelligence officers, marked on maps. Target priorities would be established. Bombing runs would be planned. The Dutch military understood the calculus. The Germans would photograph everything. They would identify every bridge, every factory, every fuel depot, every ammunition store. Then they would systematically destroy them. Not immediately. First, they needed to capture the bridges for their own use. But once Rotterdam fell, the Luftwaffe would obliterate anything that might serve the Dutch resistance or a future Allied counteroffensive. The conventional solution was demolition. Wire the bridges with explosives. When the moment came, blow them. Deny the enemy. It was doctrine. It was logical. It was also catastrophic for civilian morale and military flexibility. Lieutenant General Henri Winkelmann, commander of Dutch forces, faced an impossible choice in those first hours. Destroy critical infrastructure to slow the Germans, or preserve it and risk handing them the keys to the country. Every military academy in Europe taught the same lesson. When in doubt, destroy. Denial of resources to the enemy took precedence over preservation. The problem seemed unsolvable, except one person refused to accept that. Johannes Klaassen was not an engineer. He had no college education. Before the war, he'd been a scenic designer for the Rotterdam Municipal Theatre, painting backdrops for productions of Shakespeare and Molière. He understood perspective. He understood how the human eye could be tricked by shadow and shape. He understood that reality was often negotiable when viewed from a distance. On May 10th, he was working as a civilian contractor for the Dutch Army Corps of Engineers, sketching fortification improvements. It was modest work, poorly paid, and slightly humiliating for a man who'd once dreamed of designing Amsterdam's skyline. But it put food on his table and kept him from the front lines, where his nearsightedness and flat feet would make him useless. He was standing near the Willemsbrug around noon when a reconnaissance plane passed overhead for the third time that morning. He watched it bank lazily over the river, its camera pod visible beneath the fuselage. Around him, engineers were discussing demolition protocols. How much TNT per pylon? Which detonator systems were most reliable? The conversation was clinical, accepting, resigned. Johannes watched the plane and thought about sightlines. In theater, he'd spent years creating illusions. A painted backdrop could suggest infinite depth, with nothing but pigment and geometry. Strategic lighting could make a 20-foot stage feel like a cathedral. False perspective could convince an audience that a plywood facade was solid stone. Something clicked in his mind as the Messerschmitt completed its circuit and flew north. The Germans weren't looking at the bridges. They were looking at photographs of bridges, photographs taken from 8,000 feet in specific lighting conditions, at specific angles. Photographs that would be analyzed by men who'd never visited Rotterdam, who'd never walked these streets, who knew the city only as a collection of aerial images. The problem wasn't how to hide a bridge. The problem was how to make a photograph lie. That evening, Johannes knocked on the office door of Colonel Peter Charoux, the Corps of Engineers commander in Rotterdam. He brought a notebook he always carried, filled with sketches and calculations. His hands trembled slightly. He was a civilian contractor proposing military strategy to a career officer. The likelihood of being dismissed was high. The likelihood of being thought mad was higher. Colonel Charoux, exhausted from 18 hours of crisis management, almost turned him away. But something in Johannes's intensity made him pause. "You have 5 minutes." Johannes opened his notebook. "What if we don't destroy the bridges? What if we make them invisible instead?" Charoux stared at him. Invisible. "To aerial reconnaissance. We paint them, we camouflage them. Not in the traditional sense, not green and brown. We make them disappear into the landscape. We make them look like the river itself." The colonel's expression shifted from confusion to incredulity. "You want to paint our steel bridges to look like water?" "Not just paint, structure. We build false surfaces above the actual bridge deck. Light materials, canvas stretched over wooden frames. We paint the canvas to match the river's color and texture when viewed from above. We add false shadows to suggest ripples. We create the illusion of continuous water flow where the bridges actually exist." Charoux was already shaking his head. "It's impossible. The Germans aren't stupid. They have maps. They know where the bridges are." "They know where the bridges were before the war," Johannes countered. "But this is war. Things get destroyed. If a bridge appears to be gone in photographs, if the river appears unbroken, they'll assume it was demolished in the early fighting. They'll mark it as destroyed and move on to other targets. And when their ground forces arrive and see 7 intact bridges, by then they'll need those bridges for their own advance. They won't bomb them. Later, if they're driven back, they'll still believe the bridges are their captures, not Dutch originals. They won't prioritize them for destruction. The logic was twisted but compelling. Charoux studied the sketches. Johannes had drawn cross-sections showing lightweight frames, painted canvas, even suggestions for disguising the bridge approaches with false rubble patterns. "This is insane," Charoux said finally. "Yes, sir." "How long would it take?" 72 hours for the primary bridge, a week for secondary structures. "We might not have 72 hours. Then we'd better start tonight." The breakthrough came from Johannes's theatrical background, but the execution required engineering precision. The concept was deceptively simple. Create a false surface above the bridge deck that, when viewed from above, would blend seamlessly with the river's appearance. The actual construction was anything but simple. First challenge: materials. Steel and concrete were obviously impossible, too heavy, too resource-intensive. Johannes specified pine lumber for frames, lightweight canvas treated with fire retardant, and water-based paints that could dry quickly in spring weather. Second challenge: scale. The Willemsbrug stretched 356 meters across the Maas. Creating a convincing illusion for that much surface area meant understanding exactly how the river appeared in aerial photographs. Johannes obtained reconnaissance photos from Dutch Air Force archives, studying the texture and color of water at different times of day. Third challenge: perspective. From 8,000 feet, the human eye, or a camera lens, couldn't distinguish fine details, but it could detect anomalies in pattern. If the canvas was flat, it would read as artificial. Johannes needed to create subtle undulations that mimicked water's surface tension, variations in color that suggested depth and current. When he presented the refined plans to Colonel Charoux the next morning, the colonel made one call to General Winkelmann. The general's response was terse: "If it fails, we've wasted resources. If it succeeds, we've saved Rotterdam. Proceed." Johannes assembled a team of 40 workers, theater carpenters, painters from the city's Decorators Guild, even 2 sailmakers who understood canvas tension. Most were older men or women, those not yet called to frontline service. None of them had military training. All of them understood they were attempting something unprecedented. Work began on May 12th at 11 p.m. under blackout conditions. The Willemsbrug would be the prototype. If it worked, they'd replicate the system across Rotterdam's other crossings. The wooden frames went up first, a lattice of pine beams 2 meters above the bridge deck, creating a false ceiling. The frames needed to be strong enough to support canvas in wind, light enough that they wouldn't stress the bridge structure. Johannes had calculated weight distribution down to individual joints. The canvas came next, industrial-grade fabric sewn into sections that could be stretched across the frames like enormous sails. The sailmakers worked through the night, their needles flashing in lamplight. Each section was numbered, each attachment point marked. Precision was everything. Then came the painting. This was Johannes's domain. He'd mixed pigments to match the Maas River's specific hue, a gray-green with brown undertones, variations for shadow areas near the banks. He taught his painters techniques from theatrical scene work, how to create texture with dry brush methods, how to suggest movement with directional strokes. how to add highlight and shadow that would read correctly from extreme altitude. The work proceeded in sections. Complete 10 meters. Check the visual effect from the opposite bank. Adjust color. Refine texture. Move to the next section. It was painstaking, exhausting, and absolutely critical that it be finished before the next reconnaissance flight. Skeptics came daily. A Dutch army major inspected on the second day and declared it an elaborate waste of effort. A civil engineer calculated that the structural additions would weaken the bridge. Johannes proved mathematically they wouldn't. Civilians gathering near the work site whispered that the decorator had lost his mind. Johannes ignored them. He worked 20-hour days, climbing scaffolding despite his poor eyesight, adjusting paint mixtures by lamplight, recalculating tension on canvas sections. His hands were covered in blisters. His eyes burned from paint fumes. But the vision was becoming real. On May 15th, at 6:47 a.m., a Dornier Do-17 reconnaissance plane made its morning pass over Rotterdam. Johannes and his exhausted team watched from the riverbank, their camouflage system complete. The plane circled once, twice, then continued north. They had no way of knowing immediately if it worked. The proof would come later, in targeting decisions, in bombing patterns, or in the miraculous absence of bombs. Johannes returned to the bridge and made final adjustments. Too much was riding on this to trust a single observation. He needed perfection. It worked. Not just worked, it exceeded every desperate hope. The German aerial photographs, analyzed later, showed the Maas River as an unbroken ribbon of water. Where the Wilhelmsbrug should have been, reconnaissance officers marked "Bridge Destroyed" in red ink. Where other camouflaged crossings stood, analysts noted "Rubble, not trafficable." The Luftwaffe updated their target maps. Rotterdam's bridges were listed as previously demolished by Dutch forces. They weren't priority targets. They weren't targets at all. When German forces captured Rotterdam on May 14th, they crossed the Wilhelmsbrug expecting to find a captured Dutch bridge. They found exactly that. Never realizing they were driving across an intact structure the Luftwaffe had written off as destroyed. The irony was exquisite. The Germans were using bridges they believed didn't exist. As German forces consolidated control, they kept Johannes's camouflage systems in place. Why not? The bridges served Wehrmacht logistics perfectly, and if Allied reconnaissance thought the crossings were destroyed, so much the better. The deception worked both ways. Military analysts studying the Rotterdam campaign were baffled. Allied intelligence confirmed through resistance sources that German units were using bridges across the Maas, but aerial photographs clearly showed those bridges demolished. The contradiction couldn't be resolved until 1944, when Canadian forces liberated Rotterdam and discovered the canvas systems still in place, weathered but functional. The technique spread, though never as elegantly as Johannes's original work. German forces attempted similar camouflage on Rhine River crossings in 1944, with mixed results. British engineers studied the Rotterdam system for possible application in North Africa. American military engineers incorporated lessons from it into their 1943 field manual on deception operations. The immediate impact was measured in lives and resources. Rotterdam's bridges remained functional throughout German occupation. Resistance forces used them for covert movements. The Germans defended them, but not with the intensity they'd have applied to critical infrastructure they knew the Allies wanted to destroy. When the liberation came in 1945, the bridges stood intact, allowing Canadian forces to advance rapidly through the city. Military historians estimate Johannes's deception prevented the destruction of 7 major bridges, preserving infrastructure that would have taken years to rebuild. The economic value was calculated in millions of guilders. The strategic value was incalculable. General Dwight Eisenhower, briefed on the Rotterdam camouflage in July 1944, ordered a full technical report. His staff incorporated deception principles into Operation Fortitude, the elaborate scheme to mislead Germans about D-Day landing sites. The connection was direct. If you could hide a bridge in plain sight, you could hide an entire phantom army. Winston Churchill, always fascinated by unconventional warfare, mentioned the Rotterdam bridges in a 1945 memo about the importance of creative thinking in military planning. A theater designer, he wrote, proved more valuable than a dozen engineering colonels. We must never forget that warfare rewards imagination as much as firepower. The technique influenced post-war military doctrine. NATO training manuals included sections on structural camouflage based on Johannes's methods. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers tested similar systems during Cold War exercises. The basic principle, that aerial reconnaissance could be systematically deceived through careful manipulation of visual patterns, became foundational to modern military camouflage theory. Johannes himself received formal recognition in 1946. The Dutch government awarded him the Bronze Lion, the military decoration for exceptional service. The ceremony was small, attended mostly by the engineers and painters who'd worked on the bridges. Johannes wore a borrowed suit. He looked uncomfortable. In 1953, a researcher from the Royal Netherlands Army Museum interviewed him about the camouflage project. The interview was brief. Johannes, then 62 and working again as a theater scenic designer, deflected most questions. "I wasn't special," he told the interviewer. "I was just a guy who painted backdrops for a living and happened to know how perspective works. The real story isn't about me. It's about what happens when you listen to people outside the usual channels. How many wars have been lost because a general ignored someone who didn't fit the military mold?" He paused, looking out the window of his small workshop in Amsterdam, where he was painting clouds for a production of A Midsummer Night's Dream. The Germans had better planes, better intelligence, better training, but they looked at photographs and saw what they expected to see. That's the lesson. The most sophisticated system in the world is useless if it's built on assumptions. We didn't outsmart them with technology. We outsmarted them with paint and canvas because we understood they'd trust their own eyes more than they'd question their conclusions. The interviewer asked if he was proud of his work. Proud? Johannes considered this. "I'm relieved it worked. I'm grateful I could help. Mostly I'm sad it was necessary. War turns theaters into rubble and forces scenic designers to become military deceivers. There's nothing to celebrate in that." Johannes Klaassen died on March 8, 1967, of heart failure. His obituary in the Rotterdam newspaper mentioned his work at the Municipal Theatre and noted in the final paragraph that he'd contributed to engineering efforts during the war. The camouflage system that had fooled the Wehrmacht for 4 years earned one sentence. His workshop notebooks, filled with sketches and color calculations, were donated to the Netherlands War Museum in 1970. They're preserved in a climate-controlled archive, available to researchers by appointment. Few people request them. The Willemsbrug still stands, rebuilt in 1981 but following the original alignment. A small plaque near the eastern approach, installed in 1995, commemorates Johannes's deception work. It reads, "Here stood the bridge that wasn't there, May 1940 to May 1945. In 2003, a German military historian named Klaus Steinberg published a study of Wehrmacht intelligence failures in the Netherlands. He dedicated an entire chapter to the Rotterdam bridges, calling Johannes's Camouflage a masterwork of applied psychology. Steinberg interviewed former Luftwaffe reconnaissance analysts, now in their 80s, showing them the original 1940 photographs. One of them, Hans Müller, studied the images for several minutes before speaking. "We were trained to identify structures, to categorize threats, to check items off lists," he said quietly. "We weren't trained to question whether our eyes might be lying. This man, this theatrical painter, understood something we didn't. He understood that seeing and knowing are not the same thing. That expertise can make you blind." Muller paused. It was brilliant, infuriating, but brilliant. Hitler's biggest secret weapon wasn't the V-2 rocket or the Tiger tank, or even the early successes of Blitzkrieg. It was the absolute confidence of German military intelligence. The certainty that their systems couldn't be fooled by something as simple as painted canvas. And one rejected architect exposed that arrogance with nothing but theater tricks, wooden frames, and a deep understanding that reality, when viewed from 8,000 feet, is whatever you paint it to be.